September 11th, 1942, Willow Run, Michigan. Lieutenant General Mikhail Katukov stepped out of the black sedan and stared at the building in front of him. He'd commanded Soviet tank brigades at Moscow. He'd seen the Kharkov tank factory, one of the Soviet Union's largest industrial facilities. He'd witnessed Soviet production capability at its most impressive. Nothing had prepared him for what he was seeing now. The building stretched before him like a city made of steel and glass, one continuous structure covering 67 acres under a single roof. Assembly lines, visible through windows, extended further than he could see. The sound of machinery was a continuous roar. Workers moved in organized streams. Vehicles rolled off production lines in the distance. This was Ford's Willow Run plant, and his American hosts had just told him something that made his blood run cold. This factory will produce one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes at peak production. One complete 4-engine bomber, every hour, around the clock, every day. The plant employs 42,000 workers. When fully operational next year, it will produce more bombers monthly than Germany produces in a year. And this, General Katukov, is just one factory. We have dozens more like it. Katukov stood silent. His translator waited. His NKVD observer watched carefully, noting his reaction. Finally, Katukov spoke in Russian, then waited for translation. "Tell me, how many such factories does America have?" The American guide smiled. "For aircraft, about 90 major facilities. For tanks, another 15. For trucks, perhaps 50. For ammunition, hundreds. General, America's industrial capacity exceeds the rest of the world combined. We're not even at full production yet. We won't reach peak production until late 1943. When we do, we'll produce more war material in 1 year than all other nations combined produced in the previous decade." That evening, Katukov sat in his Detroit hotel room and wrote a report that would be classified by Soviet authorities until 1991. The report's conclusion was stark and unambiguous. Comrade Stalin must understand that we are not simply allied with America. We are allied with a production capacity that exceeds imagination. If America chose to direct this capacity against the Soviet Union, we would be defeated in months, not years, months. The wisest course is permanent friendship with America. Any other course is suicide. Soviet archives show this report was delivered to Stalin. No response was ever recorded. But for the rest of Katukov's life, he would tell trusted friends that September 11th, 1942, was the day he realized the war was already won. Not by battlefield courage, by factory production. This is the story of how American industrial capacity terrified not just enemies, but allies. How Soviet generals who had defeated Hitler's best armies felt fear when they saw American factories. How the arsenal of democracy became so overwhelming that even friendly nations realized they could never match it, never challenge it, never compete with it. This is the story of the moment when the world's second-largest industrial power realized the gap between first and second place was unbridgeable, and that understanding shaped the next 50 years of history. The 1942 Soviet delegation to America was officially about technical cooperation and Lend-Lease coordination. Katukov and other Soviet officers were shown American factories to help them understand what equipment America could supply. But the visit had an unstated purpose. Stalin wanted his generals to assess whether America could become a threat after Germany was defeated. The question wasn't whether America was strong. Everyone knew America was strong. The question was whether America was invincible. Katukov's visit to Willow Run answered that question with terrifying clarity. The scale of Willow Run was unprecedented in Soviet experience. The Kharkov tank factory, largest in the Soviet Union, covered about 20 acres. Willow Run covered 67 acres under one roof, with the assembly line alone stretching over 1 mile. The building was so large that workers used bicycles to move between departments. The floor space exceeded 3.5 million square feet. Climate control kept temperature constant throughout. Lighting was designed to eliminate shadows. Every aspect was optimized for production efficiency at a scale Soviet planners had never conceived. But sheer size wasn't what shocked Katukov. It was the organization. Every component of the B-24 bomber was manufactured to exact specifications in separate facilities, then delivered to Willow Run for assembly. The assembly line moved continuously. Each station had exactly the time needed to complete assigned tasks. Workers were trained on specific operations and performed them repeatedly with precision. Quality control happened continuously at each station. The entire system was designed so that even unskilled workers, after brief training, could produce complex aircraft to exacting standards. Soviet production used skilled craftsmen, building items from start to finish. A Soviet tank worker might work on the same tank for days. An American auto worker turned aircraft builder worked one station and never saw the finished product. The American method seemed dehumanizing to Soviet observers, but it was devastatingly effective. Ford would eventually produce over 8,600 B-24 bombers at Willow Run. At peak production in 1944, the factory completed 432 bombers in 1 month, one every 63 minutes. Soviet aircraft factories had never approached such rates even for simple fighters, much less 4-engine bombers. The workforce composition shocked Katukov as much as the production rate. The assembly lines were staffed with women, elderly men, and people who had been farmers or shopkeepers months ago. These weren't skilled industrial workers with years of training. They were ordinary Americans who had completed training programs lasting 4 to 6 weeks. The efficiency wasn't in the workers, it was in the system. The assembly line was designed so that anyone with basic competence could perform complex tasks through following clear instructions and using purpose-built tools. This revealed something profound about American industrial philosophy. Soviet industry depended on skilled workers who were difficult to replace. American industry depended on systems that made skill less important. If a Soviet skilled worker was conscripted, production suffered until a replacement was trained. If an American worker was conscripted, production continued because the system could train replacements quickly. American industry was designed for mass mobilization in ways Soviet industry couldn't match. The automation level exceeded anything in Soviet experience. Mechanical conveyors moved parts between stations. Electric hoists lifted heavy components. Powered tools reduced physical labor. The factory contained more electric motors than many Soviet cities. Power consumption exceeded the electricity used by some Soviet industrial regions. This mechanization meant American workers were more productive not because they were better workers, but because they had better tools. One American worker with modern equipment did the work of 5 Soviet workers with hand tools. Katukov toured the Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Detroit the next day. This facility covered 113 acres and was purpose-built to produce tanks. It had been constructed in less than 6 months, going from empty farmland to operational factory faster than Soviet planners would have thought possible. The arsenal was producing M3 Lee tanks at a rate of 1,500 per month, with plans to increase production further. Soviet tank production from all factories combined was approximately 2,000 tanks per month. One American factory was producing 75% of total Soviet output. The comparison became more painful when Katukov learned this was one of multiple American tank factories. The Fisher Tank Arsenal in Michigan was producing 1,000 tanks monthly. The Pressed Steel Car Company in Pennsylvania was producing another 500 monthly. The Ford Motor Company had another tank facility. The Federal Machine and Welder Company was building tanks.
Total American tank production exceeded Soviet production, despite America having entered the war only 9 months earlier. And American production was still increasing, while Soviet production had plateaued due to factory evacuations and material shortages. The quality of American tanks wasn't necessarily superior to Soviet tanks. The M3 Lee was actually inferior to the Soviet T-34 in many respects. But that almost made American production more impressive. They were building adequate tanks at rates that overwhelmed any quality advantage Soviet tanks possessed. The pragmatic American approach valued quantity over perfection. Build something good enough, build lots of it, build it fast. This philosophy was visible everywhere in American industry. The visit to the River Rouge Ford complex revealed the integration of American industrial capacity. River Rouge covered 2,000 acres and employed 100,000 workers. It wasn't just an assembly plant, it was a completely integrated facility. Iron ore and coal went in one end, finished vehicles came out the other end. The complex included blast furnaces that produced steel from raw materials, foundries that cast engine blocks, machine shops that fabricated components, and assembly lines that built finished vehicles. One facility did everything. Soviet industry distributed these processes across multiple factories in multiple cities, creating transportation and coordination challenges. American vertical integration eliminated those challenges. River Rouge had been producing civilian vehicles before the war. Conversion to military production took weeks, not months. The flexibility of American industry to shift between civilian and military production was another advantage Soviet industry lacked. Soviet industry was specialized for military production and struggled to produce civilian goods. American industry produced civilian goods efficiently and converted to military production quickly. This flexibility meant American industrial capacity could expand far beyond peacetime levels, while Soviet industry, already militarized, had less room to expand. Katukov visited the Dodge Chicago plant manufacturing aircraft engines. The facility produced 18,000 Wright R2600 radial engines annually. Each engine contained over 2,400 precision-machined parts. The quality control was extraordinary. Every engine was test run before delivery. Random engines were disassembled and inspected for defects. The rejection rate was minimal despite the production volume. Soviet aircraft engine factories produced perhaps 30,000 engines annually, total, from all factories. One American plant produced 60% of Soviet annual output with lower defect rates. The machine tool density in American factories was staggering. Automated lathes, milling machines, grinders, and specialized equipment covered factory floors. One machine operator could supervise multiple machines running simultaneously. Soviet factories had machine tools, but fewer and less advanced. Soviet operators often worked manually, where American machines ran automatically. This meant American factories with equal floor space and equal workers produced far more output because mechanization multiplied productivity. The warehouse visited in Chicago revealed American logistics capacity. The facility stored aircraft engines awaiting shipment. Katukov estimated 3,000 engines were present. These weren't small engines. These were massive 18-cylinder radials weighing over 1,000 pounds each. 3,000 engines represented more engine inventory than the Soviet Air Force possessed in total aircraft. This wasn't unusual. This was one warehouse in one city. The American logistics system maintained such inventories throughout the production chain to ensure supply never interrupted operations. American transportation infrastructure impressed Katukov as much as factories. Multi-lane highways connected cities. Railroad networks carried massive freight volumes. Ports loaded and unloaded ships with mechanical equipment. The entire system moved materials and products efficiently at scale. Soviet transportation was bottleneck, limiting production. American transportation enabled production because capacity exceeded needs. This infrastructure advantage meant American factories never waited for materials or struggled to ship finished products. The civilian economy operating alongside military production demonstrated American economic depth. Shops were full of consumer goods. Restaurants were open and busy. Civilians had cars, homes, electricity, running water. Life seemed normal despite massive military mobilization. Soviet civilians were experiencing wartime scarcity, while American civilians maintained peacetime abundance. This revealed economic capacity differential. Soviet Union was mobilizing every resource for war. America was fighting a two-front war while maintaining civilian prosperity. The visit to a steel mill in Pittsburgh revealed raw material advantages. American mills had iron ore from Minnesota, coal from Pennsylvania, limestone from Michigan, all transported efficiently via Great Lakes shipping and rail. Soviet mills had faced material shortages even before the war. German occupation of Western regions had worsened shortages. American mills operated without material constraints. They produced steel limited only by capacity, not by material availability. American steel production in 1942 exceeded 80 million tons. Soviet production was perhaps 20 million tons. An ammunition plant in Illinois demonstrated America's approach to mass production of munitions. The facility produced 50 caliber ammunition at a rate exceeding 30 million rounds monthly. Quality control ensured consistency. Workers were mostly women with minimal training. The machinery did the precision work. Operators fed materials and monitored machines. One plant produced more 50 caliber ammunition monthly than Soviet small arms ammunition production total. The gap in ammunition production meant American forces never rationed ammunition, while Soviet forces frequently did. Katukov met with American military planners in Washington and learned production projections for 1943 and 1944. The numbers seemed fantastic. Aircraft production would reach 100,000 planes annually. Tank production would exceed 40,000 annually. Truck production would hit 800,000 annually. Ship production would include dozens of aircraft carriers, hundreds of other warships, and thousands of cargo vessels. These weren't hopes. These were schedules backed by factory expansion already underway. American planners calculated production capacity the way generals calculated combat strength, and the calculations showed overwhelming superiority. The comparison with Soviet production was devastating. Soviet Union would produce perhaps 30,000 aircraft in 1943, 12,000 tanks, and limited trucks. Soviet ship production was minimal. Even with Lend-Lease assistance, Soviet production would be fraction of American output. More concerning for Katukov was the realization that Soviet production was near its maximum while American production was still increasing. The gap wasn't closing, it was widening. Every month, America built more factories while Soviet factories struggled to maintain output. The technological sophistication visible in American factories was equally concerning. Radar systems were being mass-produced. Radio equipment was standard. Quality control used statistical methods. Engineering improvements happened continuously. American factories incorporated innovations rapidly because management structures rewarded efficiency improvements. Soviet factories struggled with innovation because centralized control made changes difficult. American advantages weren't just in capacity, but in capability to improve continuously. Katukov's final stop was the Kaiser shipyards in California. He arrived by train, taking days to cross the continent. The trip revealed American geographic scale. Soviet Union was large, but distances between industrial centers weren't as extreme. America had industrial capacity spread coast to coast, making it impossible to disrupt through bombing or ground attack. This geographic distribution was strategic advantage. Destroying one factory meant little when dozens more were operating thousands of miles away. The Kaiser shipyards were producing Liberty ships, cargo vessels built from standardized designs. The construction time had been reduced to 42 days from keel laying to launch. Ships that traditionally took years to build were being completed in weeks. Kaiser employed welding instead of riveting, prefabrication instead of custom building, and assembly line methods instead of traditional shipbuilding. The result was production at rates that exceeded German U-boat sinking capacity. America was building ships faster than Germany could sink them. This meant Allied shipping capacity was increasing during the war rather than decreasing.
The workforce at Kaiser included many women and minorities. This demographic flexibility was another American advantage. When war drained male workers into military service, American industry recruited women, African Americans, and other groups previously excluded from industrial work. Soviet industry had already mobilized all available workers and lacked additional labor reserves. American society's peacetime discrimination became wartime advantage because it meant large populations could be recruited when needed. The shift work system at Kaiser meant production never stopped. 3 shifts operated continuously. The factory never went dark. Production ran 24 hours daily, 7 days weekly. Soviet factories operated multiple shifts when possible, but faced power limitations and worker fatigue. American factories had unlimited power and enough workers to rotate shifts effectively. This continuous operation multiplied productivity. Katukov's report to Stalin synthesized these observations into strategic assessment. The Soviet Union could not compete with American industrial capacity in any meaningful way. American advantages in raw materials, power generation, machine tools, transportation infrastructure, and production organization were insurmountable. The only prudent policy was maintaining permanent alliance with America, because opposing America would lead to certain defeat. Soviet military strength was insufficient to overcome American industrial advantages. The report noted specific disparities. America produced 70 times more oil, 3 times more steel, 10 times more electricity, and 100 times more automobiles than the Soviet Union. In every industrial category, American capacity exceeded Soviet capacity by factors that precluded competition. Even in categories where Soviet Union seemed competitive, like steel production, American quality and production efficiency created effective gaps larger than raw numbers suggested. Most damning was Katukov's observation about growth trajectories. Soviet production had reached its peak and faced declining trends as resources were exhausted. American production was still growing and would continue growing through 1944. The gap that existed in 1942 would be much larger by 1944. Soviet Union was running at maximum capacity. America was running at perhaps 60% of ultimate capacity. This meant that any future competition would face even larger American advantages. Katukov recommended Stalin consider post-war relationship carefully. Soviet security depended on American friendship. Antagonizing America would be suicidal. Soviet industrial capacity could not support arms race with America. Soviet military power could not defeat American military power backed by overwhelming industrial base. The wise policy was cooperation, trade, and mutual benefit. Any policy that risked American enmity risked Soviet survival. Stalin's response to Katukov's report is not documented. Soviet archives show the report was received and classified, but Stalin's actions suggest he understood the implications. Soviet Union maintained alliance with America through war's end despite tensions. Only after American demobilization reduced immediate military threat did Stalin adopt more aggressive policies. Even then, Soviet policy was cautious about direct confrontation. The Cold War remained cold, partly because Soviet leadership remembered industrial capacity gaps that made hot war unwinnable. Katukov survived Stalin's purges and died in 1976 as a highly decorated Marshal of the Soviet Union. In retirement, he spoke occasionally about his 1942 American visit. His assessment never changed. America's industrial capacity in 1942 exceeded Soviet capacity by factors that made competition pointless. If war had come between Soviet Union and America, Soviet Union would have lost, not through lack of courage or skill, but through the simple mathematics of production. Wars between industrial powers are won by the side that produces more. America produced more than everyone else combined. Therefore, America could defeat everyone else combined. This wasn't propaganda. This was observable fact. The broader lesson of Katukov's visit was about industrial warfare in the modern age. Previous wars had been decided by military factors: tactics, training, courage, leadership. Industrial wars are decided by economic factors: production capacity, resource availability, technological sophistication, and organization efficiency. The nation with superior industrial capacity will defeat the nation with inferior capacity regardless of other factors.
America's industrial capacity in 1942 was so superior that no combination of tactical brilliance could overcome it. This lesson influenced Soviet policy throughout the Cold War. Soviet planners understood they couldn't outproduce America in head-to-head competition. Soviet strategy focused on asymmetric approaches: nuclear weapons for deterrence, insurgencies to avoid direct confrontation, technology theft to avoid research costs. These strategies acknowledged industrial inferiority. Soviet Union never seriously attempted to match American production because leaders remembered what Katukov had seen in 1942. The story of the Soviet general who saw one American factory and wanted to surrender immediately captures the moment when America's closest ally realized the gap between them was unbridgeable. Katukov didn't want to surrender to Germany. He wanted to make sure Soviet Union never fought America, because such a fight was unwinnable. The factories he toured in September 1942 were terrifying not because they produced weapons to fight the Soviet Union, but because they demonstrated capacity that the Soviet Union could never match. In industrial warfare, capacity is destiny. America had capacity that exceeded the rest of the world. Therefore, America's ultimate victory was never in doubt. Katukov saw this truth in September 1942. Stalin acknowledged it through cautious post-war policies. The world learned it definitively when American industrial power reshaped the post-war order. The lesson remains relevant today. Industrial capacity still determines ultimate military power, and America's industrial capacity, while different than 1942, remains unmatched. That's not propaganda, that's just mathematics. And mathematics, as Katukov realized, standing in Willow Run, doesn't care about ideology or courage. Mathematics only cares about numbers. And in 1942, America's numbers were overwhelming.